to the HubScale podcast, where we get inside the minds of cybersecurity leaders, investors, and founders. This week, we have a very special guest, Andy Ellis. Andy is the operating partner at Weil Ventures. He's the advisory CISO for Orca Security, a Hall of Fame CSO, and the author of the 1% Leadership book. Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Elliot, thanks for having me. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, no problem, Andy. Andy, for those listeners that aren't aware of who you are, it'd be brilliant to have a bit of an introduction into your background.
Yep. So I think you just covered a lot of it. I was at Akamai for 21 years. It's basically security hire number one, became the first CISO, have 4 patents on Akamai security technologies. Now, as you mentioned, I work at Weil Ventures, where I help seed stage startups grow into successful companies. Everything from supporting ideation, supporting marketing. I sat on a couple of boards as well. So that's a lot of fun. Wrote my leadership book. I'm probably in the unique position of being the only person on the planet to be inducted into the CSO Hall of Fame. Also have a award of excellence from the Wine Spectator, and have received the Spirit of Disneyland Award.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure we could probably talk for hours on end about your background, but no, super interesting, super exciting. And I know, obviously, just for a lot of the listeners who will be tuning into the podcast, Weil Ventures is a VC we've had on quite a few times, and I know just recently we all saw the news. PitchBook, you were listed as, I think it was eighth, was it?
Eighth most success for their metric, the number 8 VC in the world, which is amazing for a seed stage. We're a boutique company. We do usually between 2 and 5 investments a year. So to get that recognition was fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. What is it, just out of interest, that makes YL so special?
So I think there's a lot of things that go into it, but I like to describe us as being like reverse private equity. And when you think about the stereotype of private equity, right? You take a public company, you buy them and bring them private, and you fire half of their executives and replace them with your own. If it's only, might be half, might be all of them, and you bring in all of your own consultants to help transform the business. And we see ourselves as doing that, but in the other direction. When we invest in a company, we're the first money they've seen. They're not a company, it's a couple of founders, somewhere from 2 to 6. We're going to provide them with a CFO, a CHRO, an entire marketing organization, 3 CISOs as their customer advisory board. And so we surround them with a full company. And then as they grow, they replace us with their own team. And we love that. Like, we work to be replaced because we have other companies we need to go support as well. So it's that focus on value add, and all of that is just included in our investment. So we don't charge them fees and services to take advantage of our staff. We literally are just trying to help them out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, awesome. And I'm sure everyone has seen the portfolio and the success from Weil Ventures, from businesses like Azonius, Twistlock, Orca, of course.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so we've had some really great companies. And look, I don't want to take all the credit. We have amazing founders. So a big piece of what I think does make us successful is the diligence we apply to selecting founding teams. In a given year, we will probably glance at 500 founding teams. We'll take a deep look at 100 of them. We'll probably walk even more closely through about 20, 25 teams. We'll get really heavy attention, but we're only going to make those 2 to 5 investments.
We'll definitely be going into that as well later on in the podcast, and just to give a bit of an overview as to kind of what we're going to be covering today. So I know, Andy, you brought out the 1% Leadership book. We'd be doing everyone a disservice not discussing that book and I guess the impact that's hoping to make within the market. We'll dive into a little bit around scaling and building organizations, and also I know Weil Ventures invests heavily on the seed side, but what it actually takes to be successful once that seed funding's come in. So we've got a super interesting podcast ahead. I guess Andy, diving into the 1% Leadership book. I know you brought it out earlier this year, if I'm correct.
Yeah, April 18th, I believe, tax day here in the United States.
Awesome. And we started, myself and the rest of the HubScale team have been reading that over the last couple of weeks. Super interesting book. I love how you've broken everything down. What was it that made you kind of decide to actually write a book just out of interest?
I hate leadership books and I hate leadership training. And I realized along the way that the reason that I hated them wasn't because they were inherently or fundamentally bad. It's that they were badly delivered. Generally, there is one message and it's almost treated like a cult. It's like, if you do this one thing, you will be an amazing leader. Often it's an autobiography or a biography. It's like, if you want to be like Jack Welch, just do stack ranking. And it oversimplifies the nuances and complexities of being a leader. And quite often it's expensive. And so we give leadership training to people who are, vice presidents and above, who really are stuck in the ways. Like, I'll admit, when I was a senior vice president at Akamai, I had my leadership style. I would listen and I would learn, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to throw it all away because someone walked in and said, this is the one true way. And what I found myself doing when I would approach leadership books or leadership training, especially if it would apply to my team, is I would want to distill down and say, look, here's the one thing they're trying to tell you. Here's a different way to look at it and how you might apply it in some circumstances and how you might not apply it. Like, let's look at the growth mindset, because that's the huge fad right now. And it's hard. All the growth mindset says is, don't tell people that they are incapable of learning. Right? It's sort of this nice double negative in there. Like, stop doing something bad to your people. It's become this management fad that's like, oh my God, everything is the growth mindset. And if someone says something won't work, you rather than listening to them, which always managers pay attention when your experts tell you something won't work, they probably know better than you tell them to embrace the growth mindset, like we weaponize it. And so that's where it sort of started from. And I wanted to create something approachable that you could hand somebody their first day in the workforce, and it had things that they could learn from. And at the same time, you could give it to somebody with 30 years in the workforce, and it would have things that would be relevant for them. So I wrote it to be these nice, clear, simple, nothing is hidden, unlike many books where you're trying to figure out what the lesson is. As I'm sure you've already noticed, every chapter title is the lesson of the chapter. So you don't have to try to figure out what it's about. I put it right up there at the beginning to repeat it at the end of the chapter. And chapters are all short, self-contained. 762 words is the average chapter length, which includes the double repeating of the message of the chapter.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. The reviews have been brilliant as well. We've been looking online quite a lot on Amazon. You can get it on Audible as well, can't you?
Yep. And I'm the reader for it on Audible. So anybody who's listening to the podcast, if you're like, oh, I love Andy's voice, it was actually recorded on an even better microphone in a better studio than what I have here.
Even better. Well, yeah, any listeners, go get that book then. No, it's awesome. And I love the way it's written out as really just focusing on improving like 1% day by day. The fact that you're not going to be perfect at something after a week, 2 weeks. I know that there's so many different theories, isn't there, around progress, not just in the workspace, but also in personal life. And everyone focuses on, I think, is it the 10,000 hours rule and things like this?
Yeah, another thing that always gets me, like there's just spend 10,000 hours on it. No, like if you're going to do the 10,000 hours, like you should have some basic core skill. Like, I am never going to be as good a footballer as Messi is. Doesn't matter if I go spend 10,000 hours. There's a man with some natural talent plus 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea here is like, if you take Messi, he doesn't just do one thing right. He does so much. He is so brilliant at everything on the pitch. And think about how much time he spends on every single one of his skills. And that's the same thing you do, right? Take care of yourself, take care of your team, take care of your organization. You can't ignore any of them.
I love how you said football as well and not soccer. We were talking
I try to pander to the audience a little bit there.
No, awesome. And I'm sure you're not going to be biased here, but do you have a favorite chapter or segment within the book?
Oh, I have a lot of them. So a lot depends on like which day it is. I think it's chapter 20 or 21. I think it's 20, which is inclusion is reducing the energy costs that people pay just to exist in a space. And one of the reasons I like it, first of all, I think it really does capture what inclusion is about, which is stop making people wonder if they belong. That's it. Right. And people try to come up with like fun anecdotes about like, oh, it's about being invited to the dance or helping pick the playlist. It's about wondering if you belong. And the less energy they spend debating if they belong, the more energy they have for you. And that sort of conclusion about like what it's for has really helped me think about what leadership really is. And at the end of the day, leadership is just about making it more efficient for people to convert their energy into value. And that sounds like very, very utilitarian, but in a sense, like that's what leadership is. And you can do it in great ways and you can do it in awful ways. But at the end of the day, are you creating more value in the organization by stopping how much you waste the energy that people have? So when you think about like, don't come into work when you're sick. And I'm glad people have figured that out with COVID now. But I had that pre-COVID, and sometimes it was don't get people around you sick, but I didn't even necessarily want you to work from home. If you are so sick that you're not fully functional, why are you spending 100% of your available energy today, where like 80% of it is dealing with, oh, I feel like crap, and maybe I get 20%. I'd rather you spend that whole 100% on healing and feeling better so that tomorrow I can get 100%.
It's so interesting. I think one of the things that we find really interesting, and especially I'm sure you've seen it throughout being with Akamai for 21 years, and you bring up a really good point there around COVID and I guess how the entire workspace like landscape has changed. And I don't think we've ever seen a paradigm shift as impactful on just the general labor market. But do you think that the traits of a successful leader has changed over the past, say, 20 years since you were in Akamai and what it is today?
So I definitely think so, because the environment that you lead in has changed. So even without doing the observation of like, what do those traits look like? 20 years ago, people worked from one office. There really was no distributed work, systems that made any sense. Like phone call, conferences were not a thing that was very interesting. We had early video conferencing technology with these giant cathode ray tube monitors. Like it was crazy. So you just look at that environment has changed to where now, look, we can do video at the drop of a hat. For those who weren't behind the scenes, we started on a different platform, switched over to this one. Like, think about just that convenience. And so how does leadership change? Well, you have to be more flexible. You have to pay attention to things like, where are all of my people? If I'm going to have a 6-person meeting and I have 3 people in the same space, like it used to be that just you wouldn't even think about it. You'd say, okay, well, we're going to meet in a conference room and there's a TV at the end with a speakerphone. And now more teams are saying, well, no, if I've got 3 people remote, then everybody just dial in from their desks so that we're all on an equal footing. And so that's a small change. And I think that leadership today requires you to think about, how do I use technology? How do I listen to what my people need? And how do I recognize, and I think this is going to be a much more significant thing post-COVID, how do I recognize that people will have more flexibility in changing jobs? They don't today because the economy is not doing great. But if you think about it, people who support remote work are basically now competing with you wherever you are in the world. As long as they can employ somebody in your country, which is still sometimes an interesting challenge. But I think we're going to see people in the US will say, well, you're making me come into the office. Why am I going to work for you? I could work for a company that's, halfway across the country, and they're willing to pay me to be at home.
Yeah. And I think along with that, even on a separate topic there, I think the employees have become so much more empowered, not just from, like you said, being able to, I wouldn't say pick and choose, but they've definitely got more options in terms of who they can work for. But even like the prominency of software or websites like Glassdoor, for example, where I know from the recruiting side with my background that candidates these days and over the last couple of years, if I'm presented an opportunity or a business, one of the first things that they're going to be doing is reviewing Glassdoor, seeing what the reviews are of the leadership team and so on and so forth, when maybe 20 years ago, that definitely wasn't even a thing, really.
Right. So they have that information, and they're also starting to be cognizant of managers who don't understand the difference between time and value. And I think if you look back 20 years ago, we paid employees for their time, and it was really up to us to hope that value showed up, right? And now if somebody's not working in the same room that you're in, you don't know what time they spend. And a lot of managers are having a hard time coping with that. That's why we see return to work being a huge, driver right now. It's because managers want to see their staff. And the reality is what you want to see is the work output. You want to understand, are they producing value? Because look, you can produce more value in 20 hours than I expected to get out of you for 40 hours. I should celebrate that. Great. You work 20 hours for me. I'm happy. You're chill because you're like, yeah, I'm not wasting 20 hours a week in meetings that weren't helpful and in my commutes. And so, maybe I get 25 hours and I get even more work out of you. And I think managers have to make that pivot, or else they're going to lose the good employees. And what they'll be left with is people who are like, oh, I'll happily show up and sit at a desk for 40 hours, but you're not getting my best 40 hours.
I think, yeah, it's really, really interesting. And there's so many different things that you can like pick apart, so many different variables as well. I guess just peeling back to the topic of books, obviously reading, self-development is something that a lot of people, 95% of the listeners will be super honed in on and focused on. And we're really interested to understand what have been the most impactful books that you've read on your career, on your life today.
Yep. So a lot of them aren't what you'd think of as direct leadership books. A lot of them are around decision making, how the human brain works. I love pointing people at Nancy Levison's Engineering a Safer World. Like if you want to do complex system safety or security, I think this is a must read. It is literally a textbook. So, for folks looking for a light read, probably not for you. But you can jump around in it and say, oh, I want to read some of these horror stories of how complex systems go bad. And I really like it because it helps you think crisply and clearly about how to solve problems at scale. And then sort of to partner with it, I love Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. So for those of you not familiar with Kahneman's work, he basically gives you a mental model of thinking about the human brain, which is there's a lot of things that are done in what he calls system one, which you can sort of think of as the lizard brain. It's the thing that works on autopilot. So, let's think about, do you have shoes with laces?
But I'm wearing sandals right now. So.
You're wearing sandals. See, it used to be I could use the shoes with laces. But like when you tie your shoe, next time you put on shoes with laces and you go to tie your shoes, try to think through every movement before you do it. And what you'll discover is you don't know how to tie shoes anymore. Like your conscious brain doesn't do the work. It's all done through muscle memory and you just do it by rote. It's like driving home. You drive the route you've always done. You get there and you're like, what just happened? I have a workout routine. I do the same exercise on Peloton for strength training, and I'm doing it yesterday. So you go through these things through ritual, and you don't remember doing them because they require no conscious effort. So that's system one. Mm-hmm. System two is the conscious brain that thinks through problems. And what's fascinating is how little work system two actually ever does. Like we're sort of optimized to not do that because it requires a lot of calories. And when you sort of think about the human brain as a complex system, now, like you can anchor onto that model and say, well, why do we make bad choices? Well, sometimes it's because we're grabbing these practice habits and using them improperly. And so that helped inform for me a lot of my leadership practice was recognizing when people weren't acting consciously and trying to sort of derail that before they dug their heels in. Because humans are great at rationalizing why they've done something that they didn't even think about doing. So when they do something you don't like, rather than fighting with them, it's like, how do I get out of this, re-educate and come back so that I can separate them? So I love those two. I'd say, and I'd say it's actually all the way over on this edge. I have my wrong finger up. The problem dealing with my mirror. Amanda Palmer's The Art of Asking. It's her autobiography. Really taught me one of the most important things. And I think you probably have seen this in the recruiting side, anybody in sales. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. And so sometimes it's just about learning to ask and then learning how to ask. And now I sometimes say next, I know I'll get a flood of email in my inbox and LinkedIn connections from people saying, Andy, you said I could just ask, can I have some of your time? The answer is probably going to be no. I'll just let you all know that because there's a lot of people asking.
So it's super interesting. And I guess just moving on to the next area of the podcast today, which is all about scaling and building organizations. And a topic that has come up in quite a few different podcasts that we've had so far, which I'd be really interested to ask you is how important is it in today, especially in today's market, for founders to embrace failure?
So I think it's massively important because that is how you learn fundamentally. People rarely learn from success because you already did something that worked in theory, so there's nothing to learn from. So you need to accept that failures will happen. And so you go to a design partnership when you're in the seed stage, you get 5 companies. If all 5 succeeded, meaning they love the product you built, that meant 4 of them were redundant. And in fact, now you have 4 people, we have 5 companies that don't want to pay you because they all helped you design the same product. However, if 4 of those companies wanted different things, you basically had to fire them at some point as a design partner because you ideated away from them. Well, it meant that you were exploring a lot of things. Like, I love that when I have companies with design partners that look vastly different. Sometimes you can bridge that gap and they both end up successful, but in different ways. But a lot of times you don't. That's a form of failure. Another thing to recognize is everybody in your leadership team needs to be growing continuously. You should put before everybody's title, if they're director level and above, you should put the round of your company, even if it's just mentally. And so you, as the founder, right, you're a seed stage CEO. You should recognize that a Series A CEO is a promotion for you. And the way to develop is say, okay, what are the skills I need? Let me go practice them. And you will practice them in safe ways to fail. But how many pitches do you fail at? Right? If you walk in and you give a pitch and your prospect starts disagreeing with you, that's a great opportunity. Don't argue with them, right? Because at the end of the day, you've already failed in your pitch. Okay, why did you fail? What can you learn from this person? What assumptions did you have that weren't working? And in asking yourself the questions about how you got to failure is how you stop failing more in the future. But absolutely, always embrace failure.
And from the VC side, I know we spoke earlier a little bit in the podcast about how Wild Ventures only invest in a select few seed each year. And obviously we've spoken a little bit through your book about growth mindset, speaking about embracing failure, but outside of the technology, and I know, of course, the background is super important, but from a characteristic standpoint, what does a VC like Wild Ventures look for in founders at seed stage?
So we're really looking for a combination of the team and the idea, right? And a lot of people argue, is it the horse or is it the jockey? The answer is both. Like, if you're not making that many investments, both have to be really good. And so you want to see, is there a CEO? Is there a CTO? Is there a head of product management? Because you recognize these are different jobs. And so gone are the days where you said, oh, I just want to invest in one bright person and they'll carry everything. So you want to see that team. So you do the interviews and you ask the different questions. You're like, oh, the person who's going to be the CEO is always answering the questions and that CTO is quiet. That's a question mark, right? Hey, why isn't your CTO the one who's really excited about this tech? And when you get asked tech questions, is jumping in and deep diving in. It's one of the reasons that when we do diligence, like, we bring in multiple people. So I'll come in and often I'm the techie, right? I come in, I'm going to ask the techie questions because I can go really deep. And it's like, oh, will the CTO engage in a conversation with me? Because if not, we're done, right? Because everybody has to be customer facing. So we're really going to look for that. Like, do they have chemistry? Do they have a great idea? And do they actually understand the problem space? That's increasingly as a challenge, which is you have a lot of people who are first-time entrepreneurs who have always been technicians, and now they're trying to sell to a CISO. And so they don't always understand the problem space of the CISO. So, how have they figured that out? Who are they talking to? Do they listen? How do they handle being corrected? That's honestly fastest way to get booted out of our process is when one of our, advisors or somebody else comes in and disagrees with you. Like, if you don't listen to them, well, how are you going to ever land a customer? Like, you don't have to pivot because somebody tells you your idea is bad. Like, it's okay to have the conviction that you're going to be right, but tactically, you have to listen when somebody tells you you're wrong.
What do you think are the main challenges that founders will face when they're going in for seed then?
So one of the biggest is, I think most of them, if they're a first-time founder, have no idea what they're about to get in for. Like, we've had founders who are like, okay, like they signed an agreement and they're like, okay, where's my money? And you're like, you don't have a bank account yet. Like, we have to help you go set up and we did. Like, we have a team that'll help you set up a bank account, but until you file your papers of incorporation, you can't even get a bank account. And in Israel, it takes longer than it does in the US. And like here in the US, it's like, oh, look, the minute you've got an EIN, like you've got a bank account that afternoon. There, it takes a little bit longer. So I think that's one of their biggest challenges, is recognizing that you've really just started on your journey. Because the Israeli VC world is a little different than, like, there are places where people really self-fund, that they have angels, friends and family are their first money, and they might run 3 or 4 years before they go for a seed stage. Often what we're looking at is 2 to 6 people who've been ideating for a year, but there is no company. They've been doing it, in somebody's living room over Google Docs. And they're like, okay, great, we've got our idea. Let's start leaving our companies and we'll go found a company and we'll go get investment money.
Because I remember we were having a debate, I think it was at Cyber Week in Tel Aviv a couple of months back, about the value of being a first-time founder versus being a multiple-time founder. And I remember one individual brought up the conversation and the argument that if a founder's already exited once or twice, they don't have the hunger that a first-time founder would have. However, obviously they've got the experience, and
yes,
they understand the roller coaster a little bit more. So it's interesting how, I guess, you can see the debate from both sides, really.
Yeah, what I want to look for, and we have several serial founders in our portfolio. Like, I love our serial founders. They are definitely more opinionated. Like, they've got a system that worked for them at least once, and they're going to go execute on that. But it worked for them. They're going to go execute on it. They already have a lot of the connections. I think one of the things a lot of founders first time don't really get is how much of your time is spent raising money. Like, the day you sign a term sheet, you're already raising money for your next term sheet. Like, it's not that you're actively recruiting dollars, but you're start pitching the company. There's this continuous cadence of investors that you talk to. Well, if you're a serial entrepreneur, there's a good chance that you actually already have a book of investors who know you, who like you. That's an easier conversation to have. So you're spending less time trying to get those phone calls and more time just giving updates to your friendly folks. And it's like, oh, hey, by the way, we're going to be doing our Series B, sometime in the next 6 months, and boom, you get a check. Like, which is very different experience from a first time, that you're going to rely more on your early stage investors to bring along those follow-on investors.
And I guess super interesting. I guess when we're looking at the post-seed phase, then is I guess the final talking point for today, and the seeds come in, the fundings come in. It's definitely not a case of, right, let's sit back and the work is done. I think a lot of the talk that we hear is about how the work starts now, and you see how that conversation continues after A, after B, after C,
Yep.
as it continues to evolve, and it's a new set of challenges and new set of skill sets that are required. But from a recruiting standpoint, it'd be really interesting for the listeners, I'm sure, to understand, like, how do those character traits, as you see, change from Series C to A to B to C, just out of interest?
Yep. So I think when you think about the seed round, so from seed to A, your company is really trying to demonstrate the possibility of product market fit. And so, when you think about the role of marketing there, a lot of it is like, just how do we get the brand out? How do we just make sure people know that we exist? And let's build some collateral, but there's not much collateral. You don't have a product yet. So, like, product marketing isn't a thing in the seed round, realistically. It's done on the side by this combination of whoever runs marketing and whoever runs product. They're like, yeah, let's write the feature sheet for this. And, maybe it's a content marketer who does it. And so then the A round usually marks okay, you think you have a product market fit possibility. Now prove it. Can you repeatedly get multiple customers who are going to buy the same product from you in this repeatable fashion, right? So you're building the starts of repeatability, but it's not really professionalized at scale. So you're not trying to, sell to 1,000 customers simultaneously. If you're happy to close like one big customer a quarter and, maybe 10 small ones, you'd be ecstatic if you did that in your A round. Like, usually those are like sort of B round numbers. So that's sort of what you're targeting. And then the B round is as you're building that execution arm. So you need very different skill sets. And what I see in a lot of our companies and other companies is you'll see this heavy churn between the CMO and the CRO, multiple times from seed to C, because it's very different skill sets. And oftentimes, your seed round head of sales, for whatever you want to call it, is really a regional sales manager, right? Somebody who was an amazing individual contributor who ran a region. Now their region is just global. But that's very different than it's the C, where you need a CRO who understands sales operations and sales efficiency and like how do you build scalable process, and you don't care how well they personally can go sell because they're not on an individual quota, right? They've got to make their whole team effective.
Yeah, we see that, of course, on the recruiting side with executive search. When you look at a seed, then you look at a Series A, and there's always such a different skill set when you're speaking to CROs or VPs of sales at Series B, and say that 0 to 5 million, that 5 to 10, that 10 to 50. The skill set is completely different.
Very different. And I think one of the biggest mistakes a lot of startups make is they don't plan for that. And you should basically say, like, you're in a B round, you should look at your CRO and you should be planning with them what their exit or their growth looks like. Because the last thing you want is to wait until they're failing and have been failing you for a year and they've killed your sales pipeline. And now you're going to fire them and start looking. Like, they should know. It's like, oh, yes, when we get our C funding, like, you won't be the CRO anymore. I'm bringing in a new CRO who's going to build out all those processes because that's not your skill set. Do you want to stay on as the regional head of sales, or do you want to move on at that point? And let's plan what that transition looks like.
Yeah. And how important is the advisory board when it comes around to bringing in or looking to bring in that, say, Series A or seed level sales leader? Because, of course, so many businesses that we've come across over the years will look to hire for an individual, and then they'll bring the right individual in for the right requirements at that given time, and then realize 6-10 months down the line that maybe they didn't identify the right ICP or the right go-to-market motion, and they have to go back to square one.
Yeah, so that's what I think where your advisory board is helpful, is helping you make sure that you as a company are on the right track. But it's a tangential effect on your go-to-market organization, which is, if you get wrong where you're going, then of course your GTM isn't going to be lined up right. But I've rarely found an advisory board that's going to directly help you land your revenue team. Like, your board might, and your investors, but your customer advisory board is often, they hate sales in general, so they don't usually have great connections there.
Yeah, no interest. And I guess I appreciate we're running out of time here as well, Andy. I just wanted to wrap up with a question that we ask everybody who comes onto the podcast, and it's amazing how many different answers that you get when we ask this question. But so if you could go back to Andy at 21 years old and give him just one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh, probably would have been buy Apple. But if I had to go with something that's a little more usable than time travel, I think the thing I would go with is you can learn from everybody, even the people you think are not competent at their job. Right? I've worked for some good managers and I've worked for some bad managers. And I will tell you that the best and most powerful lessons I have learned were from bad managers. That I looked at what they did, why it bothered me, took it apart, said, wow, they're really bad at this, but I'm actually bad at it too. And so maybe rather than just criticize them, I could take apart what I don't like about what they're doing and then apply that to myself and stop doing those things.
No, amazing. Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast this week. Really, really appreciated it. We might have to come back for round 2 because I'm sure there's so much more that we can discuss.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you around, Andy. 1% Leadership book as well, available on Audible, Amazon.
Yep, ebooks or hardcover. I like both of them.
Awesome. Well, Andy, thank you so much, and we'll see you around.
Okay, see you later, Elliot.